The malefic viper stood calmly before the lone protector and the hall master. His arrival was sudden, his presence undeniable. The lone protector stared at him, stunned. The weight of years, maybe even centuries, of waiting came crashing down in that single moment. The disbelief was obvious in his voice as he struggled to process the fact that his master was really there, right in front of him. He said as much, barely able to hold himself together. In response, the viper smiled gently and addressed him as, "Little one." Even though he was a very old man, the malefic viper apologized, saying he knew it must have been difficult, being without him for so long, keeping the faith alone through the ages. Then, without hesitation, the god embraced him. He pulled the lone protector into a hug, resting a hand on his head and telling him that he had done well. The lone protector returned the embrace, his body shaking as tears ran freely down his face. The hallmaster watched it all happen. She didn't speak. Her hands instinctively rose to cover her mouth as shock took over. She had dreamt of seeing her lord with her own eyes. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel anything like she had imagined. It was strange, touching, and completely disarming. She had pictured something more formal, more dramatic. But what she saw was personal and intimate. Then, the viper turned his attention toward her, still using the nickname, Snappy. For the lone protector, he asked who the young woman standing to the side was. Snappy quickly introduced her. He said she was the latest hall master of the order, and since theirs was the last remaining order, that made her the highest-ranking member they had left. The god didn't hesitate. He walked directly toward her, stopping only once he stood in front of her. His eyes met hers and he asked plainly for her name. She bowed slightly, trying to compose herself even as she stammered. She addressed him as, "My lord," and told him her name was Viridia. Then she went lower, fully bowing before him. Her voice trembled as she asked if she might have the honor of officially welcoming him back to the order. She also apologized deeply for what she saw as their poor performance during his absence. As she began to offer an oath, saying she would swear on her life, the viper cut her off. He told her he only asked for her name, not for her to throw herself at his feet. He sounded slightly amused as he said it. He reached down, lifted her off the floor, and as he helped her stand, he said that he should be the one apologizing to her. But then, with a grin, he added that he had already apologized to Snappy just a moment ago, and he didn't like to apologize more than once in a single day. It was a rule he tried to stick to. Viridia nodded quickly and accepted what he said without complaint, repeating, "Of course, my lord." With both of them now standing, the god patted her gently on the head. He told her that everything was fine. In fact, the mere fact that the order still existed at all was more than impressive to him. Viridia tried to remain composed, but she couldn't stop herself from blushing. The god had just patted her on the head like a child, and yet she was filled with joy. It wasn't the type of interaction she had ever expected, but the praise meant more to her than any ceremony ever could. Then, Snappy spoke up again. He turned to his master and asked why he had chosen now to return. He quickly added that he wasn't questioning the decision. He was happy about it, of course, but he was curious. He wanted to know if it had anything to do with the new universe that had recently been integrated into the system. The malefic viper looked around the chamber, then made a small comment. He acknowledged that his sudden return and everything surrounding it might have placed the others in a bit of an awkward or disadvantaged position. After a brief pause, he added that maybe what they all needed was a drink. As soon as the words left his mouth, Viridia lit up. The hallmaster turned sharply, saying she would go fetch some drinks immediately. Her excitement was hard to miss. The viper watched her go, mildly amused, and pointed out that she was quite enthusiastic. Then he turned his attention back to the lone protector. Picking up from where their conversation had paused earlier, he answered Snappy's question. Yes, he confirmed, his return had everything to do with the newly integrated universe. As he spoke, he gave Snappy a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Next, he brought up something specific. He asked if Snappy remembered the dungeon, the one he had created a long time ago in preparation for something he called the Second Era. Snappy thought for a moment, then nodded. He remembered. He asked if the viper meant the one with all the spikes. The viper confirmed it. Yes, that was the one. And then he dropped the real surprise: someone had actually managed to clear it. Snappy reacted immediately. He said that was incredible and asked if the person who did it was a newly awakened follower, but the viper shook his head. No, the person wasn't a follower at all. Then, with a small smirk, the god said something unexpected. He admitted that although it might sound strange, he thought he had made a friend. Elsewhere, deep within the great forest, it was nighttime. A small campfire crackled softly under the trees. Jake sat on the ground, chewing on a mushroom. Sissel was nearby, sitting comfortably, listening. Jake muttered something as he swallowed. He said he wasn't sure which was worse, having to eat nothing but mushrooms for weeks, or the fact that he was starting to actually enjoy them a little. Sissel replied with a casual jab, saying it still beat feeding on moss and dirt like he had to do back in the challenge dungeon. Jake chuckled and leaned back a little, eyes scanning the stars above. He started reminiscing. Back on Earth, he said, they had a delicacy called steak. Just saying the word brought a wave of nostalgia, and as he imagined it in his mind, fresh and raw, marbled steak ready to be cooked, his mouth began to water. He said out loud that he'd probably kill for some steak right about now. Then, curious, he turned to Cecile. He asked if the imp missed anything from his own world. Cecil didn't hesitate. He said no, not really. Jake looked at him sideways, not surprised. He pointed out how secretive Cecil always was about anything relating to his past. He even mentioned that, come to think of it, Cecile had never told him how he got trapped inside that holding necklace in the first place. Cecil brushed it off. He called it a long story and a half, joked that maybe he'd share it one day, if Jake got him drunk first. Jake caught on to that, grinning a little. At least that meant Cecil knew what alcohol was. He called it progress. Then, suddenly, Jake froze. Something was off. His expression changed in an instant, and his tone turned sharp. He told Cecil to get in the necklace. Cecil blinked, confused, and asked why. But Jake didn't explain. He just yelled again, more urgently this time, ordering him to get inside now. Cecil didn't argue. He vanished into the pocket dimension of the holding necklace without another word. Jake stood up and quietly moved toward the nearby bushes. His posture was calm, but his eyes were locked in the direction of the sound. Someone was there. From behind a nearby rock, bushes rustled. The group hiding there had just realized they were spotted, but Jake was already walking right toward them. Without raising his voice, he spoke clearly. He told them he knew they were there. There was no point in hiding. The moment they realized they'd been spotted, one of them stood up. He was a red-haired man and immediately raised his sword, pointing it at Jake. The others gathered close behind him, tense and alert. The man demanded to know who Jake was and what he was doing in their territory. Jake, guessing that they were acting more out of fear than confidence, made a choice. He raised both hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. Calmly, he said he was just a lone archer, not looking for trouble. He'd recently finished a hunt, and that was the only reason he was here. Then, one of the group, a woman with striking blue hair, spoke up. She asked if his name was Jake. That made Jake pause. He looked at her cautiously and asked how she even knew his name, but her expression shifted. She looked angry. Without warning, she started casting a spell. A large crystal of ice began forming above her, glowing cold and sharp. She yelled at him, saying this was for someone named Mickey. Then she called him a psycho. Jake reacted fast. He leapt into the air, dodging the attack just before it could hit him. While still mid-air, he shouted down at her, asking who the hell Mickey even was. When he landed, Jake tried again to de-escalate. He told them clearly that there must be some mistake. He said he never killed anyone named Mickey, and that there was no reason for any of them to fight. But the red-haired man raised his sword high, his stance solid. He shouted to the others not to believe a word Jake said. According to him, Richard had already warned them that Jake would say things like this. He had tried something similar when he fought the Metal Mage. Hearing that, something clicked for Jake. The Metal Mage had to be William. So, this group must be his allies. And Richard, the man in charge, must have put a bounty on him after the fight with William. That explained the hostility. Jake realized they weren't going to listen. They weren't here to talk. They wanted a fight. He sighed and slowly reached for one of his arrows. While drawing it from his quiver, he said he had hoped to settle things peacefully, but clearly, that wasn't going to happen. Looking at the 5 of them, he warned them directly. They were now marked for death. Without hesitation, 2 of the men rushed forward to attack him. One was the red-haired swordsman from earlier. The other was a rugged man with a noticeable scar and a large mallet in his grip. As they charged, they shouted that they'd find out soon enough who would be dying. The man with the mallet was the first to swing. Jake dodged just in time, moving quickly out of range. The man grunted in frustration, readying another strike. At the same time, the red-haired swordsman stepped in and swung, claiming he had a clean hit. But just as both attackers tried to make contact, Jake vanished. He used his shadow vault ability, disappearing into the darkness mid-attack, leaving both of them striking only air. Confused and momentarily off balance, the 2 men looked around, trying to figure out where he'd gone. Jake then reappeared at a distance, standing calmly and drawing back his arrow. He called out to them, getting their attention again. But before he could release his shot, something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a flaming arrow tore through the air toward him. It wasn't his. The arrow was surrounded in bright yellow flames, a clear sign of a power shot. Jake's eyes narrowed. Someone else in the group was an archer too. The arrow didn't hit him. Instead, it struck a nearby tree and exploded in a burst of violent flames. The impact scorched the bark and sent embers flying. Jake stared at the flames, surprised. Whoever this mystery archer was, they weren't a novice. They knew how to use power shot just like he did. Jake understood how power shot worked. The technique took a brief moment to charge before firing. And if that charge was interrupted, the shot could be thrown off or completely stopped. With that in mind, he came up with a quick plan. He decided to fire his own arrows to disrupt the other archers' channel time, hoping to break their rhythm before the shot could be released. But the moment Jake shot his arrow, a massive wall of ice rose up between the opposing archer and his shot. It blocked his arrow completely. The sudden wall wasn't random, it was a spell cast by the blue-haired woman. She had anticipated Jake's plan and stopped it perfectly. That was when Jake realized something important. They weren't just a random group of fighters. They were coordinated. They covered each other's weaknesses, moved with purpose, and backed each other up. This was a team used to fighting together. While he processed that, another flaming arrow, a second power shot, was already on its way toward him. Jake didn't have time to think. He instantly vanished into the shadows with Shadow Vault, disappearing before the flaming arrow could hit him. He reappeared some distance away, landing smoothly. His expression had changed. This fight was turning out to be more difficult than he'd expected. Suddenly, the red-haired swordsman and the scarred man with the mallet charged him again. They looked frustrated by his constant escapes, and one of them shouted that Jake should try dodging this next attack too. Seeing them rush in, Jake knew he couldn't rely on his bow for close combat. Without wasting time, he holstered it and drew both of his blades. He activated his twin fang style and prepared to fight them head-on. As the two came at him with full force, he moved with sharp precision, using his blades to block and deflect their attacks. Meanwhile, another man, one who had been hiding in the nearby bushes, decided this was his chance. He saw Jake preoccupied with the two in front and quietly moved in from behind, ready to strike. But Jake's instincts kicked in. He sensed the threat creeping up behind him. Now boxed in on all sides, Jake realized he was cornered. He quickly weighed his options. At that same moment, the red-haired swordsman was thinking too. He assumed Jake would probably teleport, again using that same vanishing move. If he could just guess where Jake would appear, he might be able to cut him down mid-escape. But before any of them could act, Jake did something unexpected. Instead of dodging or disappearing, Jake let the man sneaking up from behind stab him. The blade sank in, but Jake didn't even flinch. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the man, and asked with a cold expression if he was surprised. The man didn't get to answer. At the same time, the guy with the mallet tried to capitalize on the moment and swung, but he was too slow. Jake twisted, pulled his dagger free, and stabbed him with it in one quick motion. Blood sprayed. The red-haired swordsman stood nearby and watched the scene unfold in shock. Drops of blood landed on his face as his teammate collapsed. He muttered that it should have been impossible. Behind him, the blue-haired mage looked stunned. Her expression froze. Jake had just killed one of her comrades, and it had happened so fast she couldn't even react in time. Now standing over the body, Jake looked up at the remaining four. His eyes swept across each of them. Then, in a calm but clear voice, he asked, "So who dies next?" Weeks before the current battle, Jake had a private conversation with the malefic viper. They were alone, the atmosphere quiet. Jake broke the silence by asking a question that had been weighing on him. "How do you get used to it?" he asked. The viper raised an eyebrow and asked what he meant. Jake explained. He wanted to know how the viper got used to killing. He quickly clarified he wasn't saying he killed innocents, never that. But the truth was, in the span of just a few weeks, he had gone from being a regular office worker to someone who killed people as part of his daily life. It was a huge shift. A hard one. Jake admitted he didn't regret the choices he made or the battles he fought. But it still sat heavy with him sometimes. The weight of it. The violence. The viper listened, then offered a story of his own. He told Jake that back before he ascended to godhood, back when he had only just taken on a humanoid form, he thought it might be interesting to live among people. To blend in with society. Up until then, he'd only interacted with beasts who were dangerous, yes, but straightforward. They attacked, they killed, but they didn't deceive. But the enlightened races, humans and others, were different. They smiled as they lied. They shook hands while planning betrayal. Within a year of joining civilization, someone the viper considered a friend betrayed him. Tried to steal from him. Even after that, he gave them the benefit of the doubt. That was his mistake. They responded by stabbing him in the back. The viper's rage exploded. The fight that followed was brutal and long, so intense that by the time it ended, 9 planets had been destroyed. It was a level of destruction that most would call extreme. But the viper said that after that, no one ever dared to cross him again. Jake sat with that for a moment. He asked how the viper had even managed to destroy 9 entire planets. The viper brushed it off like it was no big deal. He called it a lesson for another time. Then he looked at Jake and gave him the core message. Hesitation is a luxury you can't afford. Mercy is not something your enemies will give you, so don't give it to them. That was the lesson. Back to the present. The blue-haired mage was still frozen in shock. Her comrade was dead. Jake stood above the body with his twin blades drawn and asked the question. Who's next? The red-haired swordsman looked shaken. He stepped back slightly, clearly rattled. But the mage shouted at him not to back down. She told him to hold Jake off, saying that she was going to end this. Her voice was filled with resolve. Raising her wand, she started to cast. A magical glow gathered above her, pulsing with power. She was preparing her strongest spell, and the swordsman realized it. He had to keep Jake busy, no matter what. So he charged forward again, gripping his weapon tightly. His sword came down with force. Jake raised his blades and blocked it. The clash rang out. Steel met steel as the two began to fight in close quarters. It was a furious exchange. The swordsman was skilled, but so was Jake. Their weapons collided again and again in a tight, brutal rhythm. As the fight dragged on, the red-haired man noticed something alarming. Jake's movements weren't slowing down, they were getting sharper, more focused. And at the same time, he couldn't find any gaps in Jake's defense. There were no openings, nothing he could exploit. Then Jake's eyes shifted. Just for a second, he saw something in the distance, another flaming arrow streaking toward him. Another power shot. Jake didn't hesitate. In an instant, he activated his shadow vault and disappeared from the spot. The flaming arrow blasted through the space he had just occupied, slamming into something behind him with a loud, echoing boom. Debris flew into the air. The red-haired swordsman, now realizing that Jake had vanished once again, called out to the others, urging them to locate him quickly. At that same moment, the masked archer was still struggling to understand how Jake could slip through his senses. His perception was supposed to be among the highest, and yet Jake remained elusive, nearly impossible to pin down. Before he could finish processing the thought, Jake suddenly appeared behind him. In one swift, silent move, Jake stabbed him through the back, adding another name to his growing list of victims. Elsewhere, the blue-haired mage continued charging her spell, still focused and determined. She warned her remaining allies not to panic, assuring them that her magic was almost ready. But just then, the masked archer's attention shifted. He heard something, faint but familiar, a sound he recognized. He quickly tried to warn the red-haired swordsman to stay alert. The warning came too late. Jake's power shot, launched from a hidden position, struck the red-haired man with violent force. The explosion engulfed him in flame, reducing him to a charred corpse. Now furious and shocked, the masked archer clenched his jaw and raised his bow. He demanded Jake show himself, but he didn't even have the chance to finish speaking. Jake appeared right in front of him, and in a blur of motion, decapitated him with a single clean strike. Blood sprayed outward, staining the nearby mage girl as the archer's head rolled lifelessly across the ground. Jake, wasting no time, turned his attention to her. He appeared behind her and drove a blade into her back. Blood immediately began to pour from the wound. Jake leaned close and calmly told her she had less than a minute before the injury would end her life. But he offered her a deal. If she answered his question, he'd give her a health potion to survive. As the blood continued to drip from her, Jake asked why Richard and William had sent them after him. With difficulty, the girl spoke. Through her bleeding lips, she gave a single word: revenge. Jake repeated it to himself, trying to make sense of what that meant. In his eyes, he had only ever acted in defense. He hadn't attacked anyone unprovoked. He hadn't started anything. But the girl, clearly holding deep resentment, lashed out. She blamed him for everything, accusing him of killing people and being the one who had sparked the war. She claimed this was all his doing. Jake paused, recalling a conversation with William. There had been mention of a conflict between two camps of survivors. Richard's camp and another. It was a tense situation, and now it seemed he had been thrown into the middle of it. The girl coughed up more blood. Her strength was fading. Despite everything, Jake decided to honor his word. He took out the health potion and offered it to her. But she slapped it from his hand. She told him she would rather die than be saved by someone like him. He asked her why, but she gave no answer. Her eyes simply went dull, and her body collapsed to the ground. The battle was over. With the enemies defeated, Jake opened the necklace and let Sissel out. The imp emerged, looking around at the blood-soaked scene. He asked what had happened. Jake told him honestly that he didn't fully understand it himself. But one thing was clear. He hadn't started any war. They both looked at the aftermath, the fallen bodies, the scorched earth. Cecil questioned if all of this really came from some sort of misunderstanding. Jake shook his head. He didn't believe that. To him, this wasn't confusion. It was something more deliberate. He was convinced someone was manipulating things behind the scenes. Someone wanted to frame him. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He had survived. But now he knew this was only the beginning. With the battle now behind him, Jake had taken the time to gather all the bodies of the fallen. He laid them together in a single pile, performing a rough embalming before setting them alight. The flames crackled and roared, casting dancing shadows across the area. Jake stood in silence beside Sissel, watching the fire as it slowly consumed the remains of his former enemies. The orange glow filled the forest and lit their eyes as the bodies burned, reduced bit by bit to ash and smoke. Cecil asked if Jake had any final words to offer the dead. Jake, visibly weighed down by the events, responded solemnly. He said he was sorry things ended this way. None of them needed to die, and they wouldn't have. If it had been up to him, he didn't understand how Richard or William had managed to manipulate them into thinking he had started a war, but whatever lies they were told, he promised he would be the one to end the conflict. Cecil simply offered a farewell of his own, telling the dead to rest peacefully now that it was over. As the fire continued to burn, Jake glanced at his system notifications. A message appeared, alerting him that he had reached level 31. He exhaled, more exhausted than satisfied, and muttered that it didn't feel right to go through system messages in a moment like this. It felt as though he was stealing tutorial points from the dead. Cecil, trying to reassure him, pointed out that this wasn't stealing because he had earned it. But Jake disagreed. The points he received from defeating the Den Mother, those felt earned. That was a fight he sought out, trained for, and overcame through sheer will. But this had been something else entirely. It hadn't felt like a battle. It felt like meaningless slaughter. Cecil, keeping his tone calm, told Jake that whether it felt good or not, the points were his now. The real question was what he planned to do with them. Jake repeated the question aloud, mulling it over. He couldn't exactly march into Richard's camp and demand answers. He was growing stronger, yes, but he wasn't strong enough yet. Not to take on an entire army. Even if he wanted to confront them, he wouldn't survive a direct assault. Cecil offered another possibility. Maybe it wasn't an entire army. The talk of a war might be more figurative than literal. A few dozen fighters on either side, not hundreds. Jake conceded that it was possible, but the uncertainty lingered. It could just as easily be hundreds. He didn't know enough to act, and that meant any rash decision could get him killed. Charging in blindly would only get him buried. So instead, Jake tried to think more strategically. He wondered what Adam would do if he were in this situation. The story shifted elsewhere. Far away, Adam was already deep in the woods, observing a tense meeting between two powerful figures. The leaders of the opposing camps, Richard and Hayden, were standing face to face, their conversation sharp with suspicion and doubt. Adam remained silent, quietly watching from the sidelines right next to his camp leader, Richard. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of chaos Jake had gotten himself involved in. Hayden, the head of the camp that opposed Richard's, voiced his disbelief. He didn't buy the idea that some lone archer was out there dismantling squad after squad. If someone like that really existed, someone that dangerous, they would have heard or seen more evidence by now. Richard, however, didn't share that skepticism. He corrected Hayden firmly, explaining that it wasn't just a random archer causing all the trouble. It was Jake Thane. And he wasn't killing out of madness or chaos, he was doing it with purpose. According to Richard, Jake's goal was to win the tutorial. To climb higher. The system, after all, was designed to encourage this kind of bloodshed. Killing others meant greater rewards. That was the real motivator. And Jake, in Richard's view, was simply playing the game to win. Hearing this, Hayden questioned something more personal. He asked Richard if he truly believed that Jake had killed his son. The tension between them thickened as the conversation hovered there, on the edge of accusation and uncertainty. And from the position he was standing right next to Richard, Adam continued to listen, piecing together the weight of what was unfolding. Richard didn't hesitate in defending his position. He insisted that the members of his camp had never been the ones attacking Hayden's people in the first place. According to him, the brutality inflicted on the corpses and the level of violence and precision was beyond anything his fighters were capable of. He claimed to have seen the aftermath himself and was certain it didn't come from his side. Hayden, however, looked unimpressed and clearly skeptical. He pressed further, wanting to know how they even knew anything about this Jake individual in the first place. At that point, Adam stepped forward, choosing to speak up. He explained that Jake was someone he used to work with before all this, back in the normal world. He admitted that Jake had always been a bit of a loner, but not someone violent or dangerous. When the tutorial began, Jake had proven himself a capable fighter, but so had many others. Nothing Jake had done so far, in Adam's view, definitively pointed to him being responsible for the carnage. Adam acknowledged the possibility of a third party, just like Richard had suggested earlier, but emphasized that there was no concrete proof that Jake was behind it all. Richard let out a short scoff at that. Then, with a condescending tone, he stepped toward Adam and gave him a small shove to move him aside. He addressed Hayden directly, apologizing for what he described as Adam's misplaced loyalty clouding his judgment. Richard maintained that when all factors were considered, Jake remained the most likely suspect. They could waste time entertaining other theories, or they could be pragmatic and act quickly before more lives were lost. Hayden, now mulling over Richard's argument more seriously, asked what Richard proposed if he were to accept this version of events. Richard responded without hesitation. He suggested a formal alliance between the two camps. By combining their forces into a single united squad, they could scour the forest, locate Jake, and eliminate him before he could cause any more damage. After a moment of contemplation, Hayden agreed. He reached out and shook Richard's hand, agreeing to a temporary alliance with the singular goal of hunting down and killing Jake. With the decision sealed, Adam stood silently, disappointment etched across his face. He had come with hopes of initiating peace talks, hoping reason might prevail. Instead, all he had accomplished was witnessing both camps redirect their hostility onto someone who had once been his friend. Meanwhile, William, the real threat, remained untouched and unnoticed, his manipulations still working perfectly in the background. The focus shifted elsewhere. Deep within the forest, William stood over a battlefield of his own making. The ground was littered with the bodies of slain raptors. Blood soaked the soil, the carnage fresh and raw. William stood at the center, victorious, his breathing steady as he wiped his brow. In his mind, he thought about how Richard should be finishing up his meeting right around now, if everything had gone according to plan. And if things continued to play out smoothly, Jake, the one who dared to defy him, would finally be dealt with. As he scanned through his system notifications, William noticed something new. A skill had been granted to him, the Spear of Feroris. The discovery lit a spark of excitement in him. Just then, a surviving raptor burst from the nearby bushes, hissing and charging at him. William didn't flinch. Instead, he saw it as the perfect opportunity to test out his new skill. He hurled his spear with lethal precision, aiming straight for the raptor's neck. The weapon struck true, but something unusual happened. Instead of collapsing, the raptor suddenly froze mid-motion, its entire body transforming into solid metal. William observed the phenomenon with fascination. Internally, he reflected on his last fight with Jake. That battle had shown him that he wasn't strong enough back then. But now, things had changed. He had grown stronger. Much stronger. With a violent swing, William smashed the metallic statue of the raptor, sending shattered metal and bone clattering to the ground. As the creature's skull tumbled down, he picked it up slowly, almost as if it signified the start of something new. Holding the skull in his hand, William made sort of a quiet vow to himself. No matter what came next, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way, he would be the final victor of the tutorial. The next scene opened inside the Hall of the Malefic Viper. The Hallmaster Viridia walked slowly toward a circle of lit candles, deep in thought. Her mind was focused on one strange idea. The Viper, an ancient being of unimaginable power, had somehow made a friend. She couldn't understand how it was possible. A being like the Viper was ancient, above mortals, and far removed from the concerns of those still struggling through the tutorial. Yet somehow, one mortal had caught the Viper's interest. Viridia felt uneasy. She held the highest title in the order among mortals. Yet this unknown man made her feel small by comparison. Even though he hadn't finished the tutorial, his presence was already enough to make her feel threatened. She tried to push those thoughts away, but they lingered. As she stood thinking, a man entered the hall. He asked her if she had called for him. Snapping out of her thoughts, Viridia told him that she had, and that it had been a difficult day. She said she needed his help finding something important. The man agreed and asked what she wanted him to look for. She told him she needed records. Lots of them. She explained that she wanted information about someone named Jake Thane. Everything available, she wanted it all. She needed to know more about this man who could befriend a god. Elsewhere in the forest, Jake was walking alone. He moved through the trees, calling out for familiar names, Caroline, Adam, hoping someone might answer. The woods were quiet at first, but then he heard movement in the bushes. His body tensed as he demanded whoever was there to show themselves. He braced for a fight, unsure of what to expect. Then someone stumbled out, bloody and barely able to stand. It was Casper. He collapsed to the ground, saying he couldn't walk anymore. Jake rushed to him and asked who had done this. Casper struggled to speak but managed to explain that William and Richard had attacked their camp. Everyone was dead. Friends and allies alike, no one survived. With blood still dripping down his face, Casper grabbed onto Jake's shirt. He cried, asking why Jake had left them, why he had let them all die. Jake stood frozen, his expression filled with shock, but it wasn't real. Jake woke up suddenly, sitting up by the campfire in a cold sweat. His breathing was heavy, and he was still shaken by what he had seen. It had all been a nightmare. Cecil, sitting nearby, noticed how disturbed he looked and asked if the dream had been that bad. He also joked that the mushrooms Jake had been eating might be to blame. Jake, still wiping sweat from his face, admitted that the nightmares had been getting worse each night. The imp offered a thought. He said that dreams were the mind's way of dealing with unresolved things. Maybe, he said, Jake needed to let some of it out. Jake didn't buy that idea and said it didn't sound very scientific. He turned the focus back on Cecil, pointing out that he was also awake in the middle of the night. He asked what kind of nightmare Cecil might be having. Cecil, his tone more serious now, explained that sleep was the only thing he ever did while trapped inside the necklace. And whatever nightmares he'd had, he already lived through them once. Jake paused, then said he was tired of avoiding the truth. He offered Cecil a trade. He would talk about his dreams, what they really meant, if Cecil would finally explain how he ended up sealed in the necklace. Cecil hesitated but eventually agreed. Looking up at the night sky, Jake began telling his story. He explained that when he first arrived in the tutorial, he wasn't alone. He had come with a few coworkers. Some were friends, some were just people he used to see in the office. Back then, in the old world, Jake was just another guy stuck at a desk. He described himself as someone who couldn't hold a normal conversation, someone most people didn't notice. But once they were thrown into this strange world, everything changed. The great forest was nothing like the life they'd left behind. For a while, things even seemed better. He thought maybe this new beginning would finally give him a chance to become someone different. But as Jake now realized he had been wrong, very wrong, Jake continued speaking, explaining how his goals had been different from those of his friends. While they just wanted to survive, to get through the tutorial alive, he had wanted more. He wanted to grow stronger, to live fully, to chase the opportunity the tutorial had presented. That difference in mindset led to arguments, especially with Caroline. Their fights had gotten intense, and eventually, Jake made the decision to leave them behind. He struck out on his own, believing it was the right call. But looking back, he admitted he'd left them in a dangerous situation, possibly under the influence or threat of Richard and William. Jake shared that his nightmares always took him back to that choice. In the dreams, he found his former co-workers one by one, each of them dead, lying in pools of blood. The details changed from dream to dream, but one thing stayed the same: they always blamed him. Always asked why he left and why he let them die. The guilt weighed on him. He said maybe they were right. Maybe if he had just stayed, protected them, stuck together, they might still be alive. Cecil, hearing this, commented on how heavy that burden sounded. But Jake brushed it off with a shove to Cecil's shoulder and told him it was his turn to talk. Cecil sighed. At first, he wasn't sure it was worth telling, but eventually, he gave in. He admitted that he had once been a lot like Jakey. Long ago, so long ago it felt like another lifetime, he had been one of the lowest members in the Malefic Vipers cult. Nobody respected him. He was the joke of the group, the one everyone picked on, even the new initiates. They mocked him constantly and never took him seriously. The only ones who treated him decently were a group of imps who showed him some kindness. In return, he helped them with their enchantments. But thinking back now, he realized he wasn't really their friend. He was more like a test subject. They had him try out all kinds of magical devices, and one day, they asked him to test a necklace they had created. Something went wrong. As soon as he put it on, he was pulled into a void like space inside the necklace itself, trapped. Alone. Cecil explained that while he was stuck inside, he could still see what was going on outside through a small window in the necklace. At first, he saw panic. The imps who had made the necklace were clearly terrified by what had happened. They tried to figure out how to get him out, but eventually, they gave up. He remembered the moment they dropped the necklace to the ground and walked away. After that, years passed. Dust and dirt slowly covered the window, making it harder to see. Sometimes, someone would pick up the necklace. They'd wonder aloud what happened to him, but they always assumed he'd died in some ridiculous or stupid way. Then they'd laugh and move on. No one ever came back to find him. No one ever tried again. He was just left there to rot. Cecil, clearly saddened by the memory, said that being forgotten was the worst part. Not the accident itself, not even the abandonment in the moment. It was the fact that no one ever returned, that they pushed the incident to the back of their minds and let him fade away like a bad memory. Jake, listening closely, pointed out that what happened to Cecil sounded a lot like what he had done, as he had left his friends behind just like they did. Cecil disagreed gently. He told Jake he wasn't a monster. He had made a difficult choice in a chaotic situation. That didn't make him evil. People mess up when things are uncertain and dangerous. The real tragedy, Cecil explained, isn't in making mistakes, it's in choosing to forget and never making it right. That's what the imps had done. That's what Jake still had time to avoid. But Jake was still unsure. He asked what he was supposed to do if his friends were already gone. If they were dead, how was he supposed to deal with that? How could he carry that kind of guilt? Cecil didn't have all the answers. He just placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and said that they'd cross that bridge when they came to it. For now, he told Jake, his friends might still need him. Those words sparked something inside Jake. His mind drifted back to the last moments with his team. He remembered telling them he had goals of his own. He remembered saying they would be fine under Richard's protection. He remembered the promises he made, to check in, to not disappear. Now those memories filled him with regret. But also, a new kind of determination. He finally admitted Cecil was right. He had been running from the consequences of his decisions. But that would end now. He stood up from the ground, clenching his fists. The time for running was over. Tomorrow, he would find Adam. He would face whatever came next, and one way or another, he would settle things once and for all. After Jake made his decision to find Adam, he didn't waste any time. The very next day, he and Cecil were already traveling through the forest, heading in what they hoped was the right direction. Their goal was to locate Richard's camp, though it quickly became clear the path wouldn't be so straightforward. Cecil, grumbling as he trudged alongside Jake, started complaining about the uncertainty of it all. Even though he had been the one to push Jake to do this, he now questioned whether they actually knew where they were going. He pointed out that they had been walking for quite a while and had barely seen anything promising, just a couple of wolves. A quick flashback showed those same wolves attacking Cecile earlier, and how he had barely managed to escape. Jake reminded him that he'd already been given a healing potion and would be fine. But Cecile, never one to miss a chance at being dramatic, replied that emotional trauma wasn't so easily healed. Jake laughed, calling him a crybaby, which got a reluctant smirk from Cecil. Jake then admitted that he didn't really know where Richard's camp was, but he reasoned that if they kept following the river, they were bound to find something eventually. Camps needed water, whether it was for drinking, laundry, or fishing. He figured if they stayed on this path, they'd run into someone sooner or later. Cecil teased him, saying he was starting to sound like a real hunter. Jake brushed it off, saying he'd been in the tutorial for a month already. It would have been strange if he hadn't picked up at least a few survival skills by now. After a short pause, Cecil changed the subject and asked Jake if he had thought about what he was actually going to say when they arrived. Jake responded that the first thing he would do was scout the area. He remembered that Casper had been learning how to set traps before he left the group. If Casper had gotten any better, then there was a real chance the camp would be full of traps now, and Jake didn't want to walk blindly into one. But Cecil saw through it. He pointed out that Jake seemed to be focusing on the possibility of a fight as a way to avoid dealing with the emotional weight of it all. These people weren't just enemies, they had been his friends once, and Jake had come to talk, not just fight. That made Jake pause. He admitted that not all of them were his friends. Some, like Adam and Casper, had been close to him, but others like Caroline or Bertram, he was sure they would rather not even see him if they didn't have to. It wasn't just about clearing up misunderstandings. It was about navigating a minefield of emotions, alliances, and danger. Still, Jake told Cecil that his first priority was to clear his name. He needed to explain the situation to Adam, let him know that someone had framed him. If he could get Adam to believe him, maybe Adam could convince the rest of the group. Cecil asked what would happen if that didn't work. Jake replied without hesitation. If things went badly, then traps would be the least of his worries. He pictured dozens of people coming after him, and he knew that survival would be a fight. Cecil didn't argue. He just said they should keep moving forward and hold on to hope. They walked on in silence for a while, letting the tension settle. Then, out of nowhere, Jake came to an abrupt stop. Cecil, confused, asked what was wrong, but Jake quickly hushed him, holding a hand up and pointing at something ahead. There, deeper in the forest, was something strange. A sort of shimmering curtain that stretched between the trees, flickering with colors and barely visible if you weren't looking closely. It gave off a feeling of wrongness, something unnatural. Cecil, awed by the sight, wondered aloud if it was made of water. But Jake shook his head. It wasn't water, it was magic. He could tell because when he tried to look past it using his sphere of perception, the view warped and twisted unnaturally. It was like the forest on the other side wasn't stable. Something was interfering. Jake guessed that it might be a barrier. Cecil asked if it was meant to keep them out, but Jake considered another possibility. Maybe it wasn't to keep people out, but to keep something locked in. Something dangerous. A monster, perhaps. He couldn't say for sure. But one thing was for sure, he wanted to find out. Just as Jake began moving toward the barrier, curiosity pulling at him, Cecil quickly stepped in. With a swift motion, he slapped some sense into Jake, not really out of anger, but enough to snap him out of it. He reminded Jake that they had no idea how the barrier worked. It might be a one-way passage, a trap disguised as an entrance. If Jake went in now, he might get locked inside, separated from his friends forever. Cecil's voice had an edge of urgency and Jake paused, finally realizing the risk. With a heavy sigh, Jake agreed. Cecil had a point. As tempting as it was to explore the unknown, he couldn't afford to lose sight of his real objective. Turning away from the barrier, Jake said that finding his friends came first. If he succeeded in that, maybe he could return to investigate the strange phenomenon later. Still, even as they left the shimmering wall behind, Jake couldn't stop thinking about it. He admitted that he couldn't wait to discover what was on the other side. Soon, they stumbled across a new sight, one that filled Jake with both surprise and a bit of cautious hope. Up ahead, partially hidden by trees and foliage, was a small base. Jake suspected immediately that it could be Richard's camp, and his instincts were right. Cecil, struggling to make out the details from their vantage point, admitted he was impressed that Jake could tell what he was looking at. He couldn't see much at all, but Jake explained that there wasn't anything particularly unusual going on, just people moving through their morning routines, setting up for the day. It looked ordinary. Calm. He pointed out the cabins, noting their solid structure. Whoever built them had done a good job. Then his eyes were drawn to something specific. There was a blacksmith, and nearby, someone caught his attention. Jake's breath caught for a moment. He whispered an exclamation, and Cecile quickly asked what was going on. Jake was referring to a woman sitting at a table, chatting with several others. It was Joanna. He recognized her instantly. But something was different. Her leg was back. Joanna had lost that leg during the first night of the tutorial. She'd been ambushed, and Jake hadn't been able to get there in time to save her. That failure had stuck with him. But now, seeing her not only alive but fully healed, it sparked something in him. Relief, maybe even joy. Jake smiled, explaining to Cecile who she was and how they'd met. He guessed that Caroline must have found a way to heal her, maybe through magic or perhaps a rare item. Whatever it was, it worked, and that gave Jake hope. If Joanna was alive and doing well, maybe the others were too. Cecile noticed the change in Jake's expression and commented on how happy he suddenly looked. Jake admitted that it was just good to see a familiar face again. One that hadn't been twisted by nightmares or clouded by guilt. He reminded himself that he still needed to find Adam though. That was the priority. Meanwhile, somewhere inside one of the cabins in the camp, Adam was just waking up. He lay next to a red-haired woman, the priestess healer Caroline, and chose not to disturb her. As he quietly rose, he glanced through his notifications. There it was. A reminder that only 25 days remained until this tutorial came to an end. Just 25 days until things could return to normal, or at least some version of it. He let the thought settle in for a moment before focusing on his plans for the day. Adam remembered he had a hunt coming up soon, but before that, he needed to stop by the smith. He got dressed and stepped outside, expecting a quiet morning. Instead, he was greeted by a scene already in full motion. The camp was alive with activity. People moved quickly, preparing supplies, coordinating jobs, and talking in small groups. Adam realized he had overslept more than he thought. Still, he hoped things would run smoothly. Then something unexpected happened. A sharp sound cut through the air. An arrow flew straight toward him. Adam flinched slightly, instinctively bracing for impact, but the arrow hit the ground just in front of him. He looked down, puzzled, and noticed a scroll tied to the shaft. Cautiously, he picked it up, unrolling the scroll and reading its contents. His eyes widened slightly with surprise. It was a letter from Jake, not containing any platitudes or greetings but going straight to the point. Jake was asking to meet him. Chapter 37 opened with a swarm of huge bats screeching loudly as they dove towards someone in the forest. That someone was William. Without hesitation, he charged back at them, gripping his new weapon tightly and roaring fiercely. He moved fast and precise, slicing through one bat cleanly, then stabbing another right in its body. The last bat didn't stand a chance. William tore it apart with swift, brutal strikes. When it was over, he stood among the shattered stone forms of the bats, their broken bodies stained with dark blood. He thought about how he'd spent the entire morning hunting these beasts, using the time to test and sharpen his skills. A smile crossed his face. This was what life was supposed to feel like. Full of action and power. As he walked back toward the camp, still covered in blood and still smiling, he reflected on how different he felt now. In the past, he'd have washed up before returning to the camp, trying to hide the mess. But now, partnered with Richard, he didn't see the need. He didn't care if he looked frightening. The Knave Kid act was gone, and no one bought it anymore. And honestly, with the power he had now, no one could challenge him. Then William noticed something odd. Where was everyone? The camp was usually more crowded at this time of day. He spotted a group of people crowded outside one of the cabins and peering through the windows. It was Caroline's cabin. He guessed something important must be happening, but shrugged it off. He wasn't about to pretend he cared anymore. If it was truly serious, Richard would have told him. The scene shifted inside the cabin. Jake's friends were gathered there in a tense meeting with Richard, who demanded to know what was going on. Bertram, angry and blunt, said someone had attacked Adam that morning. But Adam corrected him, explaining it wasn't an attack, it was a message. Richard asked who it was from. Adam told them it was Jake who wanted to meet him. Richard asked to see the notes. Reading the message, he joked a little, saying Jake was a man of few words and that it felt like a trap was being set. Adam disagreed. If Jake really wanted him dead, he said, the arrow would have been aimed at his neck. This might be a chance for peace, a negotiation instead of violence. Richard scoffed at the idea, clearly skeptical. Adam pressed on, suggesting maybe Jake had found out about their alliance with Hayden and thought they planned to hunt him down. If that was true, it made sense Jake wanted to talk. Richard corrected him, saying they were the ones hunting Jake, and he believed Jake wanted to strike first. Joanna, looking overwhelmed by the tension, asked if it really had to come to a fight. She said the violence was breaking her heart. Richard spat back that the violence had started with Jake, and they were only reacting. Joanna shook her head, disagreeing. She said she didn't know Jake well, but she didn't think he was a bad person. She remembered the first night of the tutorial, when she was attacked. Jake had tried to save her. Caroline wasn't convinced. She suggested maybe Jake wasn't trying to save Joanna, but was instead chasing the thrill of a fight. At that moment, Richard decided they needed privacy. He told Joanna and Bertram to leave the cabin. He wanted to keep the conversation just between himself, Caroline, and Adam. Bertram called out to Adam, but Adam nodded in agreement, saying he'd update the others as soon as possible. Once Joanna and Bertram had left, Richard turned sharply to Caroline and Adam. In order to get straight to the point and avoid a back-and-forth conversation, like the one they just had while Bertram and Joanna were here, he told them to stop the nonsense before they even started. Jake might be their friend, sure, but Richard wasn't about to risk losing his best healer, Caroline, because of this reckless plan. Adam suggested that Richard should just let him go alone, but Caroline was quick to say no. As Adam tried to protest, Caroline stood firm, insisting that if Adam went, she was going with him. Richard's frustration boiled over. He asked if they seriously expected him to let both of them walk off into what was likely a deadly trap. He reminded Adam that while he might be a fine role model for their people, he was no killer. How was he supposed to handle someone like Jake, who could take out entire teams single-handedly? Adam was calm but resolute. He told Richard that he didn't plan on fighting Jake. The meeting would be set near their base, and if things went wrong, they'd run. No need for confrontation. Richard pressed further, demanding to know why Adam was so determined to put his life on the line for a coworker. Adam replied that Richard didn't truly know Jake like he did. Adam had stayed here, followed Richard's orders for a long time, and now all he was asking was for Richard's trust. Just this once. But Richard refused. He grabbed Adam's arm roughly, saying he had no way of knowing if Adam had been secretly working with Jake all along. Who was to say Jake wasn't an enemy in disguise? This accusation stung, and Adam's anger flared in response. To cool the rising tension, Caroline stepped between them, breaking up the confrontation and urging them both to calm down. Turning to an angry Adam, she told him to go talk to Bertram and Joanna, and that she would handle things from here. Adam, still angry, dismissed the whole thing and left. Outside the cabin, Bertram asked how it went. And Adam didn't sugarcoat the situation, he said it went very badly. But no matter what Richard said, he was going anyway. Bertram put a reassuring hand on Adam's shoulder and admitted, though reluctantly, that he agreed with Richard. Adam shouldn't be wandering out into the forest to meet Jake. Adam, however, refused to back down. He reminded Bertram that they'd known Jake for years and asked if Bertram really thought Jake would hurt them. Bertram urged caution. Maybe they didn't know Jake as well as they thought. After all, they had seen what Jake did on the first night, and since then, he'd killed a dozen of Richard's men. Still, Adam couldn't accept it. He asked Bertram directly if he trusted him. Bertram said, always. Adam then asked Bertram to trust him in this situation as well, trust that Jake was innocent, and that the war had nothing to do with him. Just then, Caroline emerged from the cabin, smiling. She told them that although it took some yelling, Richard had finally agreed to let them go see Jake. Adam was surprised and asked how she managed it. Caroline laughed and said it wasn't easy. When you're the only good healer in camp, you hold a trump card. She told Adam that if Richard didn't let them go, she was ready to leave the camp herself. Adam's surprise deepened at her words. Caroline simply held him and said that, although she disagreed with Jake a lot, she didn't think he'd kill them without reason. And since it seemed important to him, it was important to her too. Now smiling, Adam thanked her. She hugged him tightly and told him she was with him till the very end. On the other side of the cabin door, Richard watched Caroline and Adam with a strained glare, his anger barely contained at the sight of their determination. We begin deep in the woods, where Jake carefully reviews the surrounding landmarks to confirm that he's in the right place. He spots a large boulder, a small river trickling by, and a cut-down tree stump. These familiar features match what he remembers, and with an agreement to himself, Jake concludes this is the spot where his former co-workers and teammates agreed to meet him. Standing nearby, Cecil looks around and wonders aloud why Jake's old friends would pick this particular location. Jake takes a moment to consider the reasoning behind it. He figures the location's close proximity to their camp might be intentional. If it's nearby, it could mean they're afraid of navigating too far into the forest. Or, more concerning, it could mean they suspect Jake might attack and want to ensure they have a short path back in case they need to retreat quickly. The thought lingers in his mind, unsettled. Cecil, picking up on Jake's negative assumptions, lightly scolds him for being so pessimistic. He urges Jake to try seeing things from a more hopeful perspective, but Jake isn't entirely convinced. He admits that while he still trusts Adam and Casper, they've spent a whole month under Richard's leadership. That's a lot of time for Richard to influence their views, and Jake knows it. A month is enough for people to change. Enough time for them to be persuaded, manipulated, or simply swayed by the wrong crowd. He doesn't know for sure what kind of person they've become during his absence. Jake then brings up the possibility that others in the group might have also taken William's side. He doesn't mention names, but it's clear he's no longer certain about where anyone stands. Cecil hopes that's not the case and brings up William directly, calling him deranged. Jake agrees and adds that William's not just unstable, he's also dangerous. As Jake continues preparing for the meeting, he sits down to sharpen his arrows, fully aware that things could go wrong. He's not planning on starting anything, but he's not walking in unprepared either. Glancing over at Cecil, Jake tells him maybe it's better if he stays inside the necklace during the meeting. He doesn't know how things will unfold, and if a fight does break out, he won't be able to keep Cecil safe out here. Cecil, although disappointed, understands. He sighs, tells Jake not to die out there, and reminds him how annoying it is being stuck in the necklace for too long. They share a brief, familiar fist bump, an unspoken promise to make it out of this, and then Jake activates the necklace, putting Cecil away. The scene then shifts to Adam and his group, consisting of Caroline and Bertram, as they carefully navigate through the forest. Bertram, still uneasy, rests his hand on the hilt of his sword. He asks Adam what exactly the plan is. Adam immediately notices Bertram's posture, and tells him to ease up. If he walks in like he's ready for a fight, that's exactly what might happen. Bertram nods and apologizes, admitting he's just a little tense. Adam reassures him, saying it's fine, but insists again that he'll handle the talking. Adam explains that the goal here is simple: keep things peaceful. No drawing swords, no spells, just words. He plans to lead the conversation, speak calmly, and try to maintain a friendly atmosphere. He doesn't want to escalate anything. Eventually, they arrive at the designated spot. Adam catches sight of someone waiting ahead and quickly identifies him. It's Jake. He tells the others that Jake's already there. He steps forward, calling out to him. Jake turns as he sees them approaching and smiles as he responds, happy that they had made it to the meeting site, honoring their agreement. Adam apologizes for the delay, and as they close the distance, he comments on Jake's appearance, saying he looks different. Jake looks like he's bulked up. Jake chuckles and says he's been getting a lot of exercise lately. Adam looks closer and thinks to himself that even though Jake has gained some muscle, he's still got that familiar nervous energy. Despite everything, this is still the same Jake he remembers. Trying to keep things light, Adam asks how Jake's been holding up. Jake responds with a short, "I'm fine." But the rest of the group stays quiet. Sensing the awkward silence, Jake then asks how they've been. Adam answers that they're doing great, but it's clear there's some tension in the air. Caroline, standing silently in the background, notices it too. She wonders why everyone's acting so strange. From the outside, this should be a reunion between old friends, but something about the mood feels off. Eventually, Adam asks Jake to explain why he called them out here. Jake answers plainly, getting to the point. He tells them about his encounters in the forest. He tells them about how he has been ambushed by people who seem to think he's responsible for something he knows nothing about. Something serious. The way they acted made it clear they thought he was guilty. Jake doesn't yet understand all the details, but he knows enough to realize that someone has framed him. This meeting is his attempt to clear the air before more damage is done. Adam begins to speak, but before he can get far, Caroline suddenly steps forward, her tone sharp and direct. She cuts through the tension and demands to know how many people Jake has killed since they last saw him. The question catches everyone off guard. Adam quickly tries to rein her in, attempting to keep the mood under control, but Caroline doesn't back down. She insists Jake answer, unwilling to let the issue slide. In response, Jake doesn't dodge the question. He admits he's taken several lives since they separated. He admits that he has had 3 different encounters that resulted in combat. But even with those incidents, he says it couldn't possibly be enough to start a war. He sounds certain. A skeptical Bertram isn't entirely convinced, though, and presses Jake further, saying he would know if Jake was lying. Jake's tone shifts, becoming more defensive. He explains that he was never the one to start those fights. Every time he only responded in self-defense. While the exchange unfolds, Caroline begins to think. Internally, she reflects on how different Jake seems from the image they'd been given. William had described someone dangerous and volatile, someone who was an unhinged threat. But standing here now, Jake feels nothing like the monster she was expecting. There's a clear contrast between what they were told and what she's seeing. Adam, hoping to cut through the confusion, tells the others that this is what he's been trying to say all along. He insists Jake didn't start anything. In his view, William must have lied to them. That's the only explanation that fits. Jake, hearing William's name come up, immediately focuses on that. He wants to know if they heard about him from William. Adam confirms that they did. Jake then warns them about what really happened. How William tried to ambush him when he came out to meet them. He tells them not to trust him. There's something wrong with William, and Jake is sure he's working toward something malicious. Adam nods, saying that he's suspected as much for a while. With everything adding up, he's starting to believe that Casper's death may not have been what it seemed. In fact, he now thinks William was the one who killed Casper. This news comes as a shock to Jake. Up to this point, he didn't even know that Casper was supposedly dead. Bertram confirms it with a grim nod, surprised that Jake wasn't aware. Jake explains that he had been checking the system notifications, trying to track the number of survivors. He had been monitoring the numbers, always wondering who might have died, but never knowing for sure. When he spotted Joanna during one of his scouting missions near their camp, he was overwhelmed with joy. Seeing her alive made him believe that maybe all of them had made it. He never even considered that the one to fall would be Casper. As this realization hits him, Jake's voice falters and he begins to cry. It's a raw, quiet moment. Adam notices and asks if he's okay. Jake says he is, but it's clear the news has taken a heavy toll. He wasn't prepared for this. Caroline, standing nearby with a hand to her face, mutters that this was a mistake. She says they never should have come. Her mood has shifted completely. Adam, noticing her reaction, asks what's wrong. Caroline tells him they should have just stayed in camp. But now, it was too late. Now they've stepped into something they can't undo. Right then, something shifts in the atmosphere. Jake freezes for a moment, eyes narrowing. He senses something, or someone nearby. There's movement in the bushes, soft rustling that stands out in the silence. Jake quickly grabs one of his arrows and points it toward the source. Whoever it is, he knows they're there, and he's not taking any chances. Adam, caught off guard by Jake's sudden change in focus, asks what he's doing. But Jake doesn't answer. His eyes stay fixed on the brush, steady and alert. The tension spikes. A moment later, the rustling stops. Realizing there's no use hiding anymore, someone steps out from behind the trees. It's Richard. He walks into the open with a confident, casual demeanor, as if the whole scene amuses him. He compliments Jake on his perceptiveness, then pauses to strike a relaxed pose, almost mockingly. With a smug expression, he makes a comment about how nice it is to see Jake again, like they're old friends catching up. With his bow still drawn, Jake watches as Richard steps out from the bushes. The sudden appearance sets off alarm bells in his mind. He immediately turns to Adam, furious. The timing is too convenient, too suspicious. Jake jumps to the conclusion that Adam was in on it, that he brought him out here just to set him up. Adam quickly tries to defend himself. He insists he had nothing to do with it. And surprisingly, Richard confirms Adam's innocence. He admits that Adam was left in the dark and offers a half-hearted apology, though it's clear he doesn't feel much remorse. He tells Adam that if he had told him about the plan, he would have hesitated, gotten soft, and possibly ruined everything. Adam, now betrayed by someone else he trusted, turns sharply to Caroline. His voice rises as he demands to know if she knew what was going on. Caroline looks guilt-ridden and admits that she did. Her eyes drop as she quietly apologizes. Adam's frustration only grows. He asks her how she could lie to him, how she could go along with something like this. Caroline tries to explain. She says that if Adam had heard what she'd been told, stories about Jake being a threat and a monster, he would have doubted him too. But Adam doesn't accept that. He cuts her off, telling her that he did hear those same stories. And yet, despite everything, he chose to trust Jake. He had faith in his own judgment and asks why she couldn't do the same. With nothing left to say, Caroline lowers her head, ashamed. Then Richard takes center stage again. With a sly smile, he tells Jake to come with him so they can clear everything up. If Jake really hadn't attacked anyone, Richard says, they could let it all go. Act like none of it ever happened. But Jake doesn't move. He doesn't lower his bow. He doesn't believe a word of it. Richard keeps talking, even bringing up the time Jake killed his archer. He says he's willing to forgive even that, just to smooth things over. But Jake isn't convinced. Beneath Richard's casual words, Jake can feel the weight of something much darker. That hidden killing intent, he senses it clearly. Jake knows Richard is lying. This isn't a peace offering. It's a trap. Still aiming, Jake tells Richard that if he really wants to talk, he needs to tell his men to back off first. That's the only way. Adam turns at that moment, confused. He hadn't seen anyone else. But then the rustling starts again. Figures emerge slowly from the woods, dozens of them. From every direction, Hayden and his men appear, surrounding the clearing. Adam is stunned. Hayden walks forward confidently, complimenting Jake's senses. Despite Jake noticing something was off, Hayden still managed to sneak in with a full team. Now standing beside Richard, Hayden is formally introduced to Jake. Richard says they're working together on this plan, this coordinated effort to capture Jake. Adam can't believe what he's hearing. He speaks up, saying he never agreed to anything like this. He thought they were here to talk, not ambush. But the truth is now unavoidable. This was a setup from the beginning. Jake activates his perception skill. His senses stretch outward, and he quickly realizes just how surrounded he really is. They've covered every angle. This frustrates him deeply. He thinks he should have noticed earlier. He's angry with himself for letting this many enemies sneak up on him despite all his training and heightened awareness. Then Richard raises his sword and points it directly at Jake. He tells him there are only two options: come with him peacefully or die where he stands. The ultimatum hangs heavy in the air. Jake clenches his jaw. He's still holding his bow, but he's outnumbered and unsure of how to proceed. Then Hayden, growing impatient, acts. He raises his hands and casts a powerful fire spell. A massive fireball hurtles toward Jake. There's no time to think. Jake reacts on instinct, leaping into the air just before the fireball explodes at his feet. The blast sends shockwaves through the clearing. As he lands, Jake retaliates, loosing an arrow toward Hayden. But the mage is ready. He conjures a shimmering energy shield just in time, blocking the shot. Realizing this is no longer a standoff, Richard gives orders to his warriors, telling them to stay back and not interfere. Hayden issues his own command to the mages: keep Jake pinned, limit his movement. The mages respond in unison, channeling their spells together. In a matter of moments, the ground beneath Jake begins to crack and buckle. Hayden, determined not to let Jake slip away, prepares another spell and hurls a fireball straight at him. Jake vanishes just in time, using his skill, Shadow Vault. To those watching, it appears as if he teleported, disappearing into thin air. In reality, he's leapt through the shadows and reappears on a nearby tree stump. But his moment of relief is short-lived. The enemies quickly spot him and fire again without hesitation, not giving him any time to breathe. From the sidelines, Adam watches Jake struggle against the relentless barrage. Unable to take it anymore, he approaches Richard and demands that he call off the attack. Adam insists that Jake isn't the killer, that this isn't justice. But Richard doesn't budge. He coldly responds that Jake had his opportunity to surrender, and now this is the only way forward. Frustrated and desperate, Adam turns to Caroline and pleads with her to intervene. The onslaught hasn't stopped, and Jake is going to be killed if no one acts. But Caroline yells back that there's nothing she can do. The situation has spun out of control, and it's beyond her power to stop the advancing wave of violence. The leaders double down. They order their soldiers and mages to maintain the pressure. They instruct them to keep firing, to give Jake no time to think, no moment to recover. Arrows, magical weapons, and explosive spells rain down on him from every direction. Hayden adds to the chaos by powering up another fireball, yelling for everyone to unleash everything they've got. Richard raises his voice as well, shouting the order to kill Jake on the spot. Inside the necklace, Cecil watches helplessly. Alarmed by what he's seeing, he begins to panic. He pleads silently for Jake to escape somehow. His concern grows with every blast and every arrow that comes dangerously close to hitting its mark. Jake, crouched and breathing heavily, begins to feel the impact of the attacks. Small bruises cover his arms and shoulders, signs of glancing blows and near misses. But he knows he won't be able to avoid all of them for long. He's overwhelmed. Internally, he concludes that one of the enemy mages must be interfering with his Shadow Vault skill. Something is preventing him from using it again, and without it, his mobility is crippled. He looks around and realizes the circle is closing in. The archers have repositioned, cutting off his retreat. Thick, magical vines erupt from the ground and wrap around his limbs. They tighten quickly, binding him in place and leaving him vulnerable. Jake curses internally as his muscles strain against the magical restraints. He sees Richard give another command. The archers take aim and fire. There's no time to dodge. One arrow pierces his shoulder with brutal force, and another slams into his leg. Blood gushes from the wounds, staining the ground beneath him. Pain explodes across his body as he falls to one knee, still restrained by the vines. His attackers declare they've got him. The trap has worked. He's pinned, wounded, and surrounded. Jake growls through clenched teeth, demanding to be released, but his voice is weak compared to the overwhelming force bearing down on him. Richard steps forward slowly, gripping the hilt of his sword with both hands. The look on his face is one of grim satisfaction. He's ready to end it. Adam, horrified at what's about to happen, yells in protest. This wasn't supposed to be an execution. Inside the necklace, Cecil covers his eyes. He can't bear to witness what's coming. The fear in his voice is clear as he mutters that they're going to kill Jake. Jake, now kneeling in the dirt, his head bowed and his teeth gnashing from the pain, knows he's seconds away from death. His body trembles, blood soaking through his clothes. He doesn't look up. He doesn't speak. Standing tall in front of him, Richard raises his sword high into the air, preparing for the final blow. He declares that it's over and that Jake would die. As Richard stood over Jake, his blade raised and positioned to deliver the fatal strike, Jake's breathing turned frantic. Each huff was filled with despair and the quiet acceptance that this might truly be the end. His body trembled beneath the weight of pain and betrayal. He thought of everything he'd been through, all the battles he'd survived, the beasts he'd slain, the trials he'd overcome. Yet now, with all his strength and skill, he found himself powerless in the face of betrayal. Despite enduring all manner of hardships, it was the betrayal of those closest to him that seemed to be his undoing. Across the battlefield, Adam tried to rush forward, visibly torn and desperate to intervene. But Caroline held him back tightly, likely trying to protect him even if it meant letting Jake suffer. Adam struggled, but she wouldn't let go. In the center of it all, Jake's thoughts turned to Cecil. Quietly, almost as if resigned to fate, he apologized to his companion, hoping that someday, someone would find the necklace and release Cecile from it. Jake was certain that his time was up. Then, just as Jake's eyes closed in grim surrender, something unexpected happened. A notification materialized before him. It declared that his bloodline ability had been upgraded to something called Moment of the Primal Hunter. Jake's eyes flew open in shock. Confusion was quickly replaced by instinct. His heart pounded faster. Something deep within him stirred, primal and overwhelming. His body, beaten and bruised, began to react. Even as Richard's blade descended toward him, Jake felt time itself stretch. That final moment, the heartbeat before the sword would have ended his life, seemed to last forever. In that elongated second, Jake became hyper-aware. He could sense every thread of mana in the air around him, like an invisible current flowing into his very core. It felt as though something inside his stomach was filling, a growing surge of pressure and power that demanded to be released. His body tensed. He couldn't contain it any longer. With a roar that echoed through the forest like a shockwave, Jake unleashed all of it at once. The magical vines that had restrained him snapped like twigs under the force of his eruption. A burst of raw energy exploded outward from his body, blasting everything and everyone around him. Enemies were thrown backward like ragdolls. Even Richard, who had been right above him, was hurled through the air and landed hard against the ground with a heavy thud. Jake's roar didn't stop there. The power that had welled up inside him continued to pour from his mouth as a concussive force. Shockwaves rippled through the battlefield, shaking the trees and the earth alike. Everyone nearby was forced to shield themselves from the overwhelming force. Richard, sprawled on the ground and bruised from the impact, struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He stared in disbelief, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of Jake's transformation. At the same time, Hayden stood in astonishment, unable to identify what kind of magic Jake had just used. Nothing they'd seen before resembled this surge of raw, primal energy. In the aftermath, Jake stood tall, completely changed. He ripped off the last remnants of his binds, his posture now menacing and wild. His breathing was heavy, but his stance was unshaken. There was no hesitation in his eyes, just raw instinct and fury. He looked nothing like the Jake they had known. To Adam, the transformation was shocking. He stood frozen, watching his friend become something entirely different, something untamed. Caroline, watching from the sidelines, could only stare in horror. The rumors she had once heard suddenly felt real. Everything the people had said, the stories of Jake's monstrous bloodlust, now seemed true. The man standing before them wasn't just Jake, he was something else, something terrifying. In her eyes he had indeed become the monster they feared. Richard, now getting back to his feet, winced slightly from the injuries the blast had left. But he wasn't ready to back down. Trying to rally his men, he barked out an order. He told them not to be afraid and that Jake couldn't possibly defeat all of them. At Richard's command, the army surged forward, their war cries echoing through the clearing as they charged at Jake like a flood of steel and fury. Shields raised, weapons drawn, and magic ready, they moved as a coordinated unit determined to overwhelm their target. But Jake stood firm. Without hesitation, he pulled out his twin blades and inhaled deeply, centering himself in the chaos. Then, in one fluid motion, he dashed toward the oncoming wave, slicing into the front lines with a lethal rhythm. His blades moved with such precision and speed that bodies dropped before they even realized they'd been struck. Richard, quickly catching on to Jake's tactic, shouted for his men to form a line and hold position. The soldiers obeyed, raising their shields in a tight formation to block Jake's advance and contain him. Jake reacted instantly. Leaping into the air, he had reached into his necklace and hurled several glass vials down at the shield wall. The vials shattered on impact, releasing a vile purplish liquid as necrotic poison splashed across their front lines. Screams followed the sizzle of the poison immediately. The substance burned through their clothes then flesh, stripping it down to bone in mere moments. The formation broke, panicked soldiers stumbling back as the toxic substance spread on their bodies. From a distance, Adam watched, stunned. He struggled to process what he was witnessing. Jake, single-handedly cutting through their forces, unstoppable in his assault. The disbelief in his words were clear as he uttered that no one seemed capable of stopping him. Hayden overheard, and his response came with a sharp edge of pride. He muttered that they'd soon find out the truth of that, and with grim resolve he stepped forward. As he moved, his eyes lit up with focused intent, and he finally activated a spell he had been keeping in reserve. In an instant, fiery wings burst from Hayden's back, bright and blazing, lifting him into the air like a divine executioner. Rising above the battlefield, he declared that he had no choice but to use this power. With his staff now aimed forward, he charged through the sky toward Jake, flames trailing in his wake. Jake spotted him immediately and tried to retreat. But the moment Hayden gained momentum, his speed became undeniable. He was closing the distance fast, far too fast. Jake had no choice but to throw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding Hayden's direct assault. The ground where he had been cracked under the blast of Hayden's fiery charge. Scrambling to his feet, Jake kept his eyes on his airborne attacker. he was still reeling from the realization that if he hadn't dodged, those wings alone could have taken his life. Their heat, their force, their speed, and the spear he held forward, it was a terrifying combination. Hayden turned midair, fire curling behind him, and prepared for another attack. This time, he taunted Jake, telling him there was no escape, that running was useless. He dove again with incredible speed and confidence. Internally, Jake knew he was right. There was no way he could outrun someone moving that fast. Even if he tried to stand and fight, reinforcements were undoubtedly on the way. A prolonged battle would be suicide. His only option, the only sliver of hope, was to use his shadow vault technique to escape. Jake crouched low, focusing his will. He prepared to slip into the shadows and vanish, praying that the technique would succeed this time. But before he could act, Cecil's voice rang out from within the necklace, cutting through the noise and tension. The message was the worst thing the archer could possibly hear. There was a barrier in place, and so Shadow Vault wouldn't work. Jake's heart sank. He scanned the area, searching desperately for the source. Someone was trapping him. Someone had planned this, boxed him in deliberately. And then a familiar voice came out with an apology. Jake turned toward it. Standing not far away, her hand glowing faintly with residual magic, was Caroline. Her expression was conflicted, but her resolve was clear. She told him they were too far and now, and that she couldn't let him escape. Jake's eyes widened. He froze, not from pain, but from the depth of her betrayal. He whispered her name, as if it physically hurt to say it. After everything, after defending himself, surviving the ambush, and enduring Richard's cruelty, it was Caroline who had locked the cage shut. As Caroline maintained the barrier around Jake, ensuring he remained trapped, Adam finally stepped forward, unable to remain a bystander any longer. With determined strides he approached her, calling out her name and urging her to stop. His voice cut through the tension, and Jake, still inside the magical confines, looked on in surprise, perhaps even a little bit of gratitude surfacing amid the grim situation. Adam pressed on, telling Caroline that this didn't have to happen, that Jake didn't have to die. He walked right up to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, trying to meet her gaze. He pleaded with her to look at him, to see reason. But Caroline, eyes cast downward and voice heavy with guilt, could only manage a soft, "I'm sorry." But before she could even finish, Richard struck. With cold precision, he stepped in and swung the hilt of his sword into Adam's head. The impact was brutal and immediate. Adam crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Richard, without a hint of remorse, looked at Caroline and dismissed her hesitation. He told her not to bother. Adam wouldn't have been convinced no matter what. Turning his attention back to Jake, Richard walked slowly toward the barrier, confident and composed. He commended Jake for his earlier maneuver, admitting that, for a brief moment, he'd believed Jake might actually escape. But that illusion had passed. With a twisted calmness, Richard concluded that Jake had only proven his point, that he was too dangerous to be allowed to live. And for that reason his execution was necessary. Then, without pause, he turned to Hayden and asked if he would like to carry out the sentence. Hayden, seething with rage, readily agreed. Jake, cornered and wounded, assessed his surroundings. The barrier around him left no room to dodge, no gaps to exploit. He thought to himself that if he could charge a power shot, there might be a slim chance he could shatter the barrier. But with the limited space and the speed of the attack coming, he knew it was impossible to channel for that long. Still, he wasn't finished. Reaching over his shoulder, Jake began pulling something from his back. Internally, he knew he had only one shot, one opportunity for a counterattack. He had to make it count. Hayden, fueled by grief and fury, took his position just outside the barrier. He declared that this was for his son, venom in his voice as he called Jake a murderer. He raised his weapon and prepared to execute a spell-infused strike known as Trial of Embers. A deadly charge augmented by fiery magic. With a powerful burst, Hayden launched himself forward. The spell was overwhelming in speed and force, and as Hayden barreled into the barrier, it shattered like glass under the weight of his rage. His weapon found its mark, plunging straight through Jake's chest and exiting through his back. Jake's scream rang out, raw and agonized, blood erupting from his mouth as his body was skewered. Hayden, panting with exertion and hatred, drove Jake's limp form into a tree with a violent slam. The bark cracked, and Jake's blood painted the trunk, running down in crimson streaks. Standing close, Hayden stared into Jake's pained expression and sneered. He whispered coldly that he hoped Jake would die slowly. He wanted him to feel every second of it. Jake's body trembled, blood streaming down his face and torso. But then, through clenched teeth and a mouth stained red, Jake spoke. His voice was weak but sharp, laced with malicious intent. He told Hayden that if he was going to die, he'd be taking Hayden with him. Suddenly, Jake's hands locked around Hayden's body. Purple light pulsed from his palms, and within moments, Hayden began to feel it, a sizzling, burning sensation that crawled across his skin. Confused and alarmed, Hayden shouted, demanding to know what was happening. What was this burning sensation? Jake, bleeding but grinning with dark satisfaction, gave his answer. He asked Hayden, almost playfully if he liked it. And then he revealed the truth: the searing pain was necrotic poison, something Jake had brewed long before. He told the mage that during Hayden's charge only moments ago, he had managed to coat his hands in necrotic poison. The same potent mixture he'd prepared well before this fight had even begun. Jake admitted that thanks to his natural resistance, the poison barely affected him. But for Hayden, it would be a different story. Jake's voice dripped with menace as he told him that in a matter of seconds, the poison would be burning through his very bones. And the moment Hayden pulled away, Jake seized his opportunity. Despite the gaping wound in his chest and the agony racking his body, he reached up with both hands, grasped the magical spear still embedded in him, and roared. With a forceful, agonizing pull, he yanked the weapon free. The sound of his gruesome yet resilient roar was followed by the loud wooden clang of the staff hitting the forest floor. Hayden, now still worried about the threat, turned to Jake with contempt. He declared that Jake's escape didn't matter. Jake was too weak to continue. He had no strength left to fight. And to prove it, Hayden raised his arms and conjured a massive fireball above his head, an orb of swirling, volatile flame. He said he would end things from a distance this time. He wasn't going to get caught up in another trick involving poison. Jake, still crouched and clenching his wound, acknowledged internally how right Hayden was. He was in no condition for another fight. The hole in his chest throbbed with every breath, his strength was dwindling, and even standing fully upright felt like a distant luxury. Then Hayden hurled the fireball at him with fury, shouting for Jake to take it. But something was off. At that moment, Jake didn't flinch. Instead, a devilish grin curled at the corners of his blood-stained mouth. It was almost like he knew something they didn't. After that, the fireball struck the tree behind Jake with a thunderous impact. The explosion lit up the night, engulfing the entire trunk in a cyclone of fire. The flames devoured everything, leaving the tree nothing more than scorched ash and smoke. Hearing the blast, both Richard and Caroline sprinted toward Hayden. Caroline's eyes were wide with shock as she asked what had happened, but Hayden didn't answer at first. He was too stunned, too consumed by the pain from the poison and the uncertainty in his gut. Richard, however, was furious and impatient. He demanded answers, shouting over the crackle of flames. His voice turned desperate as he screamed to know where Jake was. "Where is his damn body?" he barked, startling even Caroline with the sheer force behind his words. That's when Hayden finally answered, breathless and shaken. He told them the truth, the terrible, unthinkable truth. Jakey, the primal hunter, had escaped. Not far from the wreckage of the battle, Jake was already moving. He staggered through the forest, one bloodied hand pressed tightly to the hole in his chest. His breathing was labored, his clothes soaked with blood, and each step left a fresh crimson mark on the ground. But still, he walked, one foot in front of the other. Internally, Jake told himself he couldn't stop now. The shadow vault had worked, but only just. It bought him distance, not safety. If he stayed in one place too long, they'd find him again. Inside the magical necklace, Cecil stirred, worried and anxious. He called out to Jake, asking if he was okay. But Jake, anticipating what Cecil might do next, immediately warned him. He told the imp to stay put. It was still far too dangerous to come out. They weren't out of this yet. And so Jake pressed on, dragging his wounded body deeper into the forest, leaving behind a trail of blood with every step he took. He repeated to the imp that he shouldn't come out until he finds somewhere safe. Somewhere to recover. Until then, survival meant staying one step ahead. Richard, unwilling to let the moment slip away, barked out orders with sharp urgency. He commanded every soldier to fan out into the forest. He wanted them scouring every inch of it. No delay, no mercy. Jake couldn't have gotten far, not in his condition. The troops didn't hesitate. At Richard's word, they sprang into motion, sprinting in every direction with weapons drawn and senses sharp. As they disappeared into the forest, Richard added one more command that made his intentions clear. He told them this was likely their only chance to capture Jake, and if they found him, they were to kill him. Far ahead of them, hidden by distance but not out of danger, Jake felt the pressure tightening around him. He could feel the subtle shifts in the air, the ripple of movement that betrayed his pursuer's presence. He glanced back, his mind sharpening. It wouldn't be long before they found his trail. Inside the pocket dimension of the necklace, Cecil's voice broke through the tension. The imp told Jake to look up ahead at something he has seen. Jake turned his eyes forward, and there it was. The barrier. That strange, multicolored, flickering veil he and Cecil had noticed a while back, while searching for Richard's encampment. It stood there now like a doorway, stretching through the woods with no clear end in sight. Jake limped toward its edge, muttering to himself. He remembered the challenge dungeon from before. That dungeon had a protective field, too. One that rejected anyone beneath a certain level threshold. If this one worked the same way, then maybe, just maybe, it could act as a wall. Maybe the soldiers wouldn't be able to pass through it, and he could finally disappear from their reach. But Cecil, still watching from the safety of the necklace's inner realm, wasn't convinced. He shook his head and gave a grim reminder. If this barrier really was anything like that dungeon, then stepping into it might just lead Jake into even more danger than what he was fleeing. Jake paused at the threshold, placing a blood-stained hand against the shimmering surface. For a second, he considered. Then, with a tired but determined breath, he muttered that it was a risk he'd have to take. He had no other option if he wanted to survive. Without further hesitation, he pushed himself forward. The magic of the barrier rippled as his body passed through, piece by piece, until he was completely on the other side. Inside, the forest looked different. From within the necklace, Cecil spoke again, cautiously optimistic. He asked Jake how it felt. Could he sense anything? Jake answered softly, nothing yet. No danger. No hostile auras. Maybe, just maybe, they were safe. He let out a tired sigh and closed his eyes briefly. His entire body was trembling. Blood still leaked steadily from the wound Hayden had left, and every breath was harder than the last. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake whispered that he might finally have a few seconds to rest. Then, just as he thought the worst might be behind him, that fleeting moment of relief shattered. A pressure prickled at his skin. A presence. No, it was many of them. His eyes snapped open and his body tensed on instinct. Something was wrong. From the thick brush ahead, the undergrowth trembled. Then, without warning, they emerged monstrous, primal, and furious. A horde of red-scaled, yellow-eyed beasts charged into view. Jake took one look at them, at their massive claws, sharp teeth, and snarling faces, and let out a dry chuckle. Of course, he said through gritted teeth, a wary smile pulling at his cracked lips. Still smiling bitterly, Jake muttered to himself, almost amused by the absurdity of it all. What a shitty way to die. They circled around him, pacing slowly but deliberately, closing off every direction of escape as though they were herding prey. Jake, already drained and barely holding himself upright, too much blood had already left his body. His limbs were cold, his vision flickered. His body no longer even registered pain. As one of the beasts sank its teeth into his shoulder, Jake didn't cry out. The sensation was distant, almost numb. Another creature clamped onto his leg, dragging him slightly, and yet still no agony came. Instead, he found himself quietly acknowledging that this truly might be where his story ended. Then a third one lunged, claws extended, snarling as it prepared to finish him off. Still restrained by the two biting down on him, Jake could only watch as it pounced. And in that frozen moment, a bitter realization crept into his mind. His expression reflected more than pain, it showed something deeper. Disappointment, even sadness. But before the final blow could land, something unexpected happened. A voice echoed out of nowhere, deep, amused, and filled with a sardonic tone. It was the voice of the malefic viper, the ancient dragon serpent god. The entity expressed mild surprise at seeing Jake like this. Jake now stood in a new place entirely. He was no longer within the forest. The pain was gone. His bloodied, tattered form had vanished. The malefic viper sat leisurely on a floating rock, suspended by nothing at all, holding a drink in hand. With casual arrogance, the divine being made a dry remark about how rude it was for someone to barge into another's domain without so much as a warning. He sipped from his glass as though none of this were unusual, clearly amused by Jake's sudden appearance. Jake, still stunned by his abrupt shift from near death to this surreal plane, tried to piece together what had happened. Just moments ago he had been on the verge of being devoured. Now he was standing here, fully healed. He asked, still reeling, what had just taken place. In response, the serpent god toyed with his drink and gave a vague, half-serious answer. He reminded Jake of the blessing he had granted him during their previous meeting, a divine mark given not just as a boon, but as a link. That blessing, the Viper explained, created a mutual connection. They were bound together now in a strange way. Despite the gravity of the conversation, the malefic Viper remained relaxed, even amused. He confessed that he hadn't really expected Jake to just show up here unannounced. In fact, this was a first even for him. Jake asked if the Viper had summoned him, but the being clarified that while he had helped ease the process, it wasn't exactly a summoning. Jake himself had somehow triggered it, whether by instinct, desperation, or sheer willpower. It had been Jake who initiated the crossing into this divine space. Jake, still trying to make sense of his surroundings, turned to the malefic Viper and asked where exactly they were. In response, the serpent god made a grand, sweeping gesture with his arm, proudly referring to their current location as the headquarters of his order. He spoke of the place with a reverent satisfaction, describing it as magnificent. With a wry note in his tone, he even likened it to his own personal bedroom, his sanctuary, so to speak. Jake couldn't help but make a sarcastic remark, joking that the Viper was certainly humble and down to earth. The comment didn't go over the divine entity's head. He understood the sarcasm and responded with a bit of self-awareness, noting that if one were ever to seek ascension to godhood, a touch of ego was practically a requirement. Then, still amused, he invited Jake to take a seat beside him. Before Jake could settle down, a sudden jolt of panic overtook him. His hands shot up to his neck as he realized the necklace was missing. With a sharp sense of urgency, he asked where it had gone, his voice filled with concern. Cecil was still inside it, at least that was the last thing he remembered. But the Viper, calm and unbothered, simply waved off the concern. He told Jake to relax, assuring him that Cecil was likely with his physical body. He explained that Jake had probably released the imp before slipping into unconsciousness. Jake, still uneasy but trying to trust the explanation, eventually sat down next to the Viper. The question still nagged at him though, so he asked what exactly the being meant by real body. Did this mean Jake wasn't actually here? The malefic Viper, casually sipping from his glass, explained the situation. Jake's condition was critical, his body teetered on the edge of death. He wasn't entirely alive in the conventional sense, but he wasn't fully dead either. He existed in a kind of liminal space, somewhere between both states. Yet Jake's primary concern wasn't for himself, it was for Cecil. He expressed his need to return, to make sure the imp wasn't in danger. But instead of acting immediately, the Viper placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, attempting to steady him with a reassuring presence. He told Jake to calm down, stressing that while his body was in the process of healing, stress would only complicate things. The more Jake panicked, the more difficult his recovery would be, especially for his soul. That last part caught Jake off guard. He didn't understand what his soul had to do with any of this. The concepts being thrown at him no longer made sense, and he said so plainly. The Viper responded with a knowing patience, explaining that the subject of karmic projections was far too complex for someone of Jake's current level, especially given the limitations of his human heritage. It wasn't an insult, just a reality. Certain things, particularly those involving the soul and higher forms of metaphysical interaction, were difficult to grasp without transcending those natural limits. As Jake absorbed this, he allowed himself to glance upward at the view surrounding them. The sky above wasn't one of clouds or sunlight. It was filled with distant stars, swirling galaxies, and cosmic beauty that painted the heavens like an astral tapestry. It truly did feel like the heart of something divine. Amid that awe-inspiring silence, the Viper continued. He explained that Jake's soul had come to this place on its own, guided by an instinctive sense of safety. Somewhere deep within Jake's subconscious, a choice had been made, one meant to preserve his life. Faced with inevitable death, some part of him recognized this domain as a place where he could survive, even if only for a while longer. It had been a risky move, the god admitted. But Jake's instincts had made the call when his conscious mind could not. Listening to this, Jake quietly reflected on how often those instincts had saved him lately. They weren't just random bursts of adrenaline, they had become something deeper, something primal. And now apparently, they had gone so far as to reach out to a god. The malefic Viper, still swirling the liquid in his glass, remarked calmly that danger had a way of sharpening one's instincts. In moments like those, survival wasn't so much a decision as it was a reflex embedded deep within the soul. Jake, still visibly uneasy despite the surreal calm of their surroundings, turned to the godlike being with the question that had been bothering him a little: when and how would he return to his real body? The Viper answered without much flair, simply stating that Jake would return naturally once his body had finished healing. There was nothing to do but wait for now and hope that no one found his body before that healing was complete. That thought struck Jake hard. The worry registered instantly on his face, his expression tightening as he asked what would happen if someone did find him. The Viper's demeanor shifted. He gave Jake a cold, direct stare and told him bluntly that it would mean instant and permanent death. No coming back. Meanwhile, in the real world, the harsh reality of that possibility played out. Just within the barrier's edge, Cecil was dragging Jake's unconscious body across the dirt. The imp grumbled angrily, voicing his frustration aloud even though Jake couldn't hear him. He reminded the motionless body that he had warned him not to enter the barrier, that it was dangerous, but as usual, nobody ever listened to the imp. As Cecil strained with the effort, he muttered sarcastically that Jake should at least be grateful for being let out of the necklace before his master had apparently dropped dead. When he had emerged, he'd found Jake already unconscious, perhaps dead for all he knew, and alone in the middle of a dinosaur-infested death zone. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Cecil had been forced to fend off the creatures himself. It hadn't been easy. The imp had used every bottle of necrotic poison he could get his tiny hands on, scattering them to repel the red, scaled beasts and keep them from tearing Jake's body apart. Somehow, the tactic had worked. Whether it was the stench or the lethal reputation of the toxin, the monsters had backed off, giving Cecil enough time to act. Now, after what must have been a painful, exhausting effort, the imp had successfully dragged Jake's limp body to a somewhat safer spot. Grumbling all the while, he claimed that Jake was lucky he'd lost so much blood, because otherwise, there was no way a tiny imp like him could have moved such a heavy load. He even added bitterly that maybe he should have left Jake out in the open after all. Maybe that's what he deserved. But the irritation faded. Cecil's voice softened, and with a heavy sigh, he admitted to himself what he didn't want to say aloud. He asked more to the body than to anyone. Who was he kidding? The truth was, he didn't know what he would do without Jake. And finally, he whispered a plea, desperate and quiet, for Jake to wake up, back in the surreal space that the malefic viper called his bedroom. Things had taken on a different tone. The serious conversation between the two had turned into a more personal exchange. Jake scoffed at something the viper had just proposed, declaring that it had to be the dumbest idea he'd ever heard. The viper, completely unbothered, chuckled and told Jake to cut him some slack. He defended his idea by saying it had sounded good at the time, though his tone made it clear that hindsight had changed his opinion. Just outside the cosmic chamber, someone else had taken interest in their discussion. The hall master had her ear pressed against the door, clearly eavesdropping with great curiosity. From within, she could hear Jake joking that if the goal was to get slapped in the face, then sure, the idea made perfect sense. The hall master furrowed her brows. The casual tone of the conversation she overheard didn't match anything she expected. This was the malefic viper, the godlike being whose presence alone could shake entire regions. Yet here he was, bantering with someone like they were long-time companions. She leaned in closer, her thoughts racing. Who in the world was in that room with him? As the hall master continued to press her ear closer to the chamber door, trying to make sense of the strangely casual conversation inside, she began to rationalize what was happening, or at least her best try at a rationalization anyway. In her mind, this had to be some kind of divine test. The malefic viper, her god, was surely gauging her loyalty or resolve, perhaps expecting her to act in defense of his honor. Convinced now that this was a divine directive, she stiffened her posture, pushed open the door with determined urgency, and loudly proclaimed that she would defend his honor immediately, just as he wished. But the sight that met her eyes instantly shattered the momentum of her dramatic entrance. There, seated side by side in the celestial chamber the viper had earlier referred to as his bedroom, the hall master froze, eyes wide, completely blindsided by the ordinary atmosphere she'd interrupted. The dramatic speech she'd begun fell apart in her throat. In a hurried pivot, she stammered that she wasn't going to do anything after all. Clearly, she had interrupted something important. Her tone shifted awkwardly, and the intensity with which she had opened the door now stood in comical contrast to her immediate retreat. Seeing an opportunity to ease the awkwardness, the malefic viper made a smooth transition and formally introduced her to Jake. He turned to his guest and explained that the woman before them was named Viridia, and that she was the one responsible for overseeing the mortals in this particular region. As Jake's name passed the viper's lips, Viridia's demeanor shifted again, but not in embarrassment this time. She recognized the name instantly. So this was Jake, the one tied to her god, the one she'd heard about. Her expression tightened slightly as her eyes began to analyze him more carefully. It made her curious and possibly a little wary. Jake gave her a friendly greeting, waving nonchalantly and saying it was nice to meet her. That one small gesture, casual and polite, had an unexpected effect on Viridia. In a flustered rush, she bowed immediately and began apologizing profusely for interrupting. She referred to him as the Chosen One, a title that caught Jake off guard but only made the atmosphere more tense and awkward. Watching her over the top reaction, the malefic viper winced slightly, visibly affected by second-hand embarrassment. He muttered under his breath that she'd just made things a little weird. Trying to redirect the situation back to something more productive, the viper invited Viridia to sit with them. He explained that they had been discussing an important topic and her presence would be useful. The subject, as he described it, revolved around a particularly thorny matter: how to deal with someone from Jake's past, specifically, a former crush who had recently tried to kill him. He was clearly referring to Caroline. The weight of that topic pulled the conversation back into more serious territory. Jake picked it up again, expressing how he still couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened, the betrayal, the attack, was just one massive, stupid misunderstanding. The malefic viper wasn't having it. He cut through Jake's sentiment without sympathy, pointing out that whether it was a misunderstanding or not didn't matter. The bottom line was that Jake had almost died. He'd walked blindly into what was clearly an ambush, and that kind of mistake couldn't be brushed off. The viper emphasized that what had already happened was done, and now, Jake's focus needed to shift. His new mission should be clear: to get revenge on those who had tried to end his life. Jake began to defend himself, trying to explain that he'd only made the choices he did because he thought he could. But the viper didn't let him finish. Before he could complete the thought, the divine being reached out and placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. His voice was sharp now, cutting off the excuse mid-sentence. He told Jake bluntly that whatever he had thought wrong. He had been foolish. And worse, he was still too weak to afford the luxury of making those kinds of mistakes. Viridia, still seated with Jake and the malefic viper, chose that moment to speak up again. She voiced her unwavering belief in the wisdom of her divine patron. Whatever he said, whatever advice or instruction he gave, She believed it to be absolute truth. In her eyes, his words were not to be questioned. They were the correct answers by default. The malefic viper let out a long, theatrical sigh at her display of loyalty. While he clearly appreciated the sentiment, he couldn't help but make a light jab. He noted aloud that while devoted followers were nice to have, they often made for terrible conversation partners. The comment caught Viridia off guard. She blinked at him in disbelief, clearly not expecting the critique, even if it came with a smirk and a teasing undertone. Shifting gears, the viper turned his full attention back to Jake. With a serious tone, he asked him what it was that he truly desired, what he wanted deep down, at the core of his being. Jake, not entirely sure how to respond at first, gave the simplest answer that came to mind. He wanted to return to his body. He didn't want to die. That was his main concern. But the malefic viper wasn't satisfied with that. He pressed Jake to think deeper, bigger, to reach beyond the fear of death and reflect on what his heart truly longed for. Jake fell silent for a moment, reflecting. Then, with a clearer mind, he started to speak. This time, there was more weight behind his words. He said he wanted to fix the mess surrounding Adam and the others. He wanted to make sense of the betrayal and chaos. He spoke of revenge, of what Hayden did to him, driving a blade straight through his chest. He declared that he wanted to kill Richard and William, those who had played their parts in this web of deceit. But that wasn't all. His tone shifted as he clenched his fists and a different kind of desire surfaced. He admitted that he craved battle, the thrill of victory, the rush of facing strong opponents and the high that came from defeating them. He wanted more of that, again and again. He wanted to test himself against the strongest foes he could find. As he stood and looked up at the glittering expanse of stars above them, he voiced his final desire to grow stronger, endlessly stronger, until he reached a point where he could do whatever he wanted. No limits, no chains. The malefic viper smiled at that answer. He found it fitting, worthy even. He told Jake that true freedom, the kind Jake had just described, was indeed a noble goal. But he warned him that real freedom could never be achieved by someone who remained tethered to the past. Freedom came at a cost, and that cost was power. Power didn't come easy, and it didn't come cheap. The viper told Jake that he had to hunger for it, chase it relentlessly. If he truly wanted to live freely, then he had to become someone no one could betray. Not because of trust, but because betrayal would mean destruction. He had to become someone who could crush those who turned against him without hesitation, treating them like insects. He went on to say that one day, Jake would find himself standing atop a mountain of corpses, metaphorically or perhaps literally. And when that moment came, he had to make sure he was the only one left standing at the peak. That, the viper said, was what it meant to be truly free. As he delivered those words, something strange and powerful began to happen. Jake's entire form started to glow, faint at first, then more intensely, until his entire body radiated with a blue light. The energy shimmered and pulsed like his soul was preparing to return to where it belonged. Viridia's jaw dropped in awe, her eyes widened, and she exclaimed aloud what she was seeing. She called him the Chosen One, once again unable to contain her astonishment. Jake, still glowing with that ethereal light, turned to the viper and calmly said that he thought his body was calling his soul back. The malefic viper nodded, understanding that their time together was at its end. He told Jake it was time for their goodbye, and added that he hoped they would meet again someday. In a rare and strangely fitting gesture, the two gave each other a fist bump. Jake thanked the godlike being sincerely, telling him that their conversation had meant a lot to him. It had given him clarity, purpose, even comfort. And then, just like that, Jake's soul vanished from the chamber, pulled away toward his physical form. The room was silent for a brief moment after his departure. Then, the malefic viper turned to Viridia and casually asked her what she thought of him. Viridia didn't hide her reaction. Her cheeks flushed a bright, unmistakable red, and she answered honestly, perhaps even impulsively. She said she thought Jake was absolutely remarkable. The next chapter begins with Jake in the cave where Cecil had dragged his unconscious body some time before. Now, Jake was awake and active, focusing on his workout. He was doing sit-ups, counting each repetition carefully in his mind as he pushed through the physical effort. Nearby, Cecil was sleeping peacefully but began to slowly wake up. As Cecil's eyes blinked open and adjusted to the dim light in the cave, he noticed Jake and for a moment wasn't sure if it was really him or just a trick of the light. Then as Cecil took a closer look, he saw Jake fully healed, looking much better than before. Jake was in the middle of his workout, clearly exerting himself with heavy breaths and visible signs of effort as he continued doing sit-ups. The sight was a surprise and relief to Cecil, who immediately realized Jake had somehow pulled through the terrible injuries he had suffered. Jake responded with a friendly greeting, smiling warmly at Cecil as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The smile showed that despite everything, Jake was in good spirits. Cecil, overwhelmed with happiness, quickly moved closer and wrapped his small frame around Jake's head in a tight embrace. Jake acknowledged this. explaining that he knew how close he had come to death and that he'd been lucky to survive the ordeal. Jake then apologized to Cecile for making him go through all that trouble, acknowledging that dragging his body all the way to this cave must have been hard work. He said he really owed Cecile one for all the effort and care Cecile had shown. Cecile reassured him that despite being frustrated and angry at first, once he realized what Jake had done, especially how Jake had freed him from the necklace before passing out, he felt deeply grateful. Cecile explained that being freed like that probably saved his life, because if Jake had died with Cecile still trapped inside the necklace, Cecile would have been stuck there forever, trapped and powerless. Cecile reflected on the significance of Jake's action, pointing out that even when Jake thought he was done for, when he thought all hope was lost, he still cared enough to release Cecil and give him a chance to live freely again. For Cecile, that was a profound gesture and a debt he felt he could never truly repay. When they bumped fists in a sign of friendship and mutual respect, Jake told Cecil not to worry about repaying anything, because that was simply what friends did for each other. The conversation then shifted slightly when Cecil brought up a different but related topic. Since they were talking about friends and loyalty, Cecil asked Jake if he wanted to discuss what had happened during the ambush. Jake was in the process of getting dressed, and he said there really wasn't much to say. He admitted he had made a mistake at the ambush but said his goal was to learn from that mistake and move forward rather than dwell on it. Cecil took some responsibility as well, admitting that he shouldn't have pushed Jake into meeting with his former friends since the idea had actually come from him. But Jake reassured Cecil that meeting with his old friends wasn't the real problem. It was something that had to happen. The true mistake was his lack of strength and power at the time. If he had been stronger and more capable, it wouldn't have mattered whether the situation was an ambush or not. He would have been able to handle it no matter what. Jake clenched his fist tightly, and with a determined look in his eyes, he told Cecil that he was done treating his training and progress like some kind of childish game. Just as he was thinking this, a blue notification window suddenly appeared in front of him, signaling that his system inbox was full. Jake hadn't checked any of his system alerts since before the meeting had turned into the dangerous ambush. So now, curious and somewhat anxious, he decided it was time to catch up on all the messages he'd missed. As he opened the inbox, he was immediately hit with a barrage of notifications, flooding the screen faster than he could read them. He exclaimed in surprise and frustration, overwhelmed by the sheer number of alerts. Then, one particular notification caught his eye, stating that he had slain a spearman of embers. This stood out because Jake didn't remember killing anyone by that name. He thought to himself that it was probably referring to Hayden, the one who had stabbed him through the chest not long ago. But that was strange because Jake knew for certain he hadn't killed Hayden. He recalled that just yesterday he had hit Hayden pretty hard by smearing that acid, like necrotic poison on him, which had caused significant damage, but surely that alone wasn't enough to kill him. Jake swiped through more of his notifications, noting with growing confusion that many of them claimed he had killed people he never actually did. The list seemed to be full of false kills, at least from his point of view. Cecile, watching this, suggested that maybe someone else must have finished off those enemies for him. Jake's expression darkened, and a flicker of anger crossed his face as he guessed that it was probably Richard. His mind raced, putting pieces together. Gritting his teeth, he thought about how Richard had likely used him as a pawn in his own games, using Jake to weaken their mutual enemies so Richard could gain an advantage. Jake cursed Richard quietly, calling him a bastard for manipulating the situation and taking credit for kills that were not his own. The thought of being used this way stung deeply. Trying to ease the tension, Cecil shrugged and pointed out that at least Jake had gotten some experience points for participating, even if only a little, in killing those enemies. It wasn't nothing, and every bit of experience would help him grow stronger. Then, something unusual happened. Instead of the usual blue notification window, a bright yellow notification suddenly appeared, shining with a brilliance that caught both Jake and Cecil off guard. The light was much more vivid and intense, and they both stared at it in stunned silence. Jake wondered out loud what a class evolution might be, while Cecil speculated that if it looked that shiny and impressive, it was probably something special. Shortly after, another blue notification appeared. This one praised Jake's skills, commending everything he had done so far, facing dangerous foes, fighting with determination, and showing strong ambition. The message then asked Jake if he would like to begin the evolution process now. Without hesitation, Jake accepted. He knew this was exactly what he needed. If he was going to survive what lay ahead, he had to become stronger, and this evolution seemed like the perfect opportunity to do just that. After he accepted, a new window appeared, congratulating him for evolving his class. It told him that he had reached level 25 and his new class name was Ambitious Hunter. Jake liked the sound of that immediately. The name fit well with his mindset and goals. Then, A detailed description notification popped up, explaining everything he needed to know about the new class.